Before England became an empire, before its ships ruled the oceans, before its name shaped the modern world, there was a moment when everything nearly ended. A moment when a small island nation stood alone against the greatest superpower on earth, an empire rich beyond imagination, an army blessed by faith, a fleet so vast it darkened the horizon itself. This was not just a war, it was a battle for survival. In the late 16th century, Europe was divided by power, religion, and ambition. Kings ruled by divine authority. Empires expanded across oceans. And one woman, a queen many believed should never have ruled, stood at the center of it all. Elizabeth of England, a monarch surrounded by enemies, threatened by assassination, challenged by rebellion, and targeted by the most powerful king in Europe. Spain believed England would fall quickly. Its ruler, King Philip II, saw himself as chosen to restore order to a divided world. He prepared an invasion unlike anything Europe had ever seen. 130 ships, thousands of soldiers, a floating army sent to erase a nation. History expected England to lose, but history does not always follow expectation, because while Spain relied on power, England relied on something else: strategy, defiance, and the courage of a queen who refused to abandon her people. This is the story of fear turned into resistance, of commanders who changed naval warfare forever, of ordinary men preparing to defend their homeland against impossible odds, of storms that reshaped destiny, and of a ruler whose greatest battles were not only fought at sea, but within the loneliness of the crown itself. You will witness the rise of a global empire, the clash between faith and politics, the psychology of leadership under threat, the fall of an unstoppable armada, and the final years of a queen who carried a nation's future alone. Because the defeat of the Spanish Armada was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. The beginning of modern England, and the legacy that still shapes the world today. This is the story of the queen who faced the Spanish Armada. If you enjoy powerful stories from history, stories that shape the world we live in, today consider subscribing to Think Smart Media. Because some moments in history didn't just change a nation, they changed the course of the world. Now, let's begin. History remembers triumph. It remembers golden crowns, victories, legends, but it rarely remembers how fragile those victories were. In the mid-1500s, England was not powerful. It was unstable, financially strained, religiously divided, surrounded by enemies stronger than itself. Spain controlled oceans. France dominated continental politics. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents. England was uncertain whether it would survive the century. And yet, within one reign, that fragile kingdom would transform into a rising power. Culture would explode. The navy would expand. Trade would globalize. National identity would solidify. Historians would later call it the Golden Age of Elizabeth I. But here is the deeper truth. Golden ages are not born from comfort. They are born from pressure. And Elizabeth Tudor was forged in pressure long before she wore a crown. Elizabeth was born in 1533. Her father, Henry VIII, desperately wanted a son. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had promised him one. When Elizabeth was born female, disappointment filled the court. But that disappointment would soon turn into something far darker. Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery and treason, charges many historians consider politically motivated. In 1536, she was executed. Elizabeth was 2 years old. In one stroke of a sword, her mother was gone. Her father remarried, and Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. She lost her title. She lost security. She lost certainty. Imagine growing up knowing your father ordered your mother's death. Imagine knowing that your position in the royal court exists only because it is convenient. Elizabeth learned early that royal blood did not guarantee safety. She was raised carefully but cautiously, watched, observed, measured. Under tutors like Roger Ascham, she received one of the finest humanist educations of the era. She studied Latin, Greek, French, Italian theology, classical philosophy. She read Cicero. She read Plato. She read political history. But more importantly, she learned rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, the art of appearing agreeable without surrendering control. These skills would later define her reign. Because Elizabeth understood something early in a court filled with ambition. Survival required intelligence, not emotion. Her childhood was not warm, it was strategic training disguised as education. And when she finally became queen in 1558, she was not naive, she was prepared. Before Elizabeth Tudor became one of the most powerful monarchs in history, before her name defined an entire golden age, before England rose from vulnerability to global influence, she was a child surrounded by ambition and execution. She was born into a court where survival was never guaranteed, where love could disappear overnight, where power was measured not in loyalty, but in who remained alive. Elizabeth Tudor was born on September 7, 1533, inside the Palace of Greenwich. Her father, King Henry VIII, was one of the most powerful and feared rulers in Europe. But when Elizabeth was born, the court did not celebrate the way Henry had hoped. Henry did not want a daughter, he wanted a son. He wanted an heir who would secure his dynasty and prevent civil war. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, had promised him that son. Her promise had cost England everything. Henry had broken from the Catholic Church itself to marry her. He had defied the Pope, separated England from Rome, destroyed centuries of religious unity, all for Anne, all for the promise of a male heir. But when Elizabeth was born, that promise remained unfulfilled, and in Henry's court, disappointment was dangerous. Anne Boleyn's position weakened almost immediately. The same nobles who once praised her began watching her carefully. The same court that once admired her began whispering, because in Tudor England, power did not remain still. It shifted constantly, and those who lost favor rarely survived the fall. Among the most powerful men in England was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Cromwell had helped Henry break from the Catholic Church. He had helped engineer Henry's marriage to Anne, but Cromwell understood something Elizabeth would later learn herself. Power depended on usefulness, and usefulness could expire. By 1536, Anne had not given Henry a son. Her influence was declining. Henry's attention was shifting to Jane Seymour. Cromwell saw the change, and he adapted. Anne Boleyn was arrested, charged with adultery, charged with treason. Charges many historians now believe were fabricated. She was taken to the Tower of London. Elizabeth was 2 years old. She would never see her mother again. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed. A single sword stroke ended her life. But its psychological impact on Elizabeth would last forever, because Anne's death sent a message that echoed throughout Elizabeth's childhood. No one was untouchable, not even a queen. After Anne's execution, Henry declared their marriage invalid. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. She lost her title as princess. She lost her position in the line of succession. She was no longer a symbol of the future. She was a political complication. Henry remarried quickly. Jane Seymour gave him what Anne had not, a son, Edward, Elizabeth's half-brother. Edward became the center of Henry's attention. Elizabeth became peripheral, not abandoned, but no longer essential. She grew up watching how quickly power shifted, how quickly favor disappeared, how quickly survival became uncertain. She lived in royal households, but never with permanent security. She was raised among nobles but always aware of her fragile position. She was educated but also observed because Elizabeth's existence carried political meaning. She was both royal and illegitimate, both insider and outsider. This duality shaped her psychology. Unlike many royal children, Elizabeth learned caution early. She did not assume safety. She did not assume loyalty. She learned to read people, to observe their tone, their posture, their hesitation. Because in Henry's court, words were not always honest. Intentions were rarely spoken directly. Elizabeth's tutors recognized her intelligence early. One of the most influential was Roger Ascham, one of England's greatest humanist scholars. Under his guidance, Elizabeth received an extraordinary education. She studied Latin, Greek, French, Italian, philosophy, history, political theory. She read the works of Tacitus, who wrote about tyranny and power. She read Cicero, who wrote about leadership and persuasion. She read Plato, who explored the nature of authority. She was not being trained merely as a noblewoman, she was being trained as a thinker. Ascham later wrote that Elizabeth possessed one of the finest minds he had ever taught. But intelligence alone did not ensure survival. Elizabeth also studied behavior. She watched how nobles interacted with her father, how they praised him publicly even when they feared him privately. She watched how alliances formed and collapsed. She watched how quickly men like Thomas Cromwell could rise to immense power and then fall. Because in 1540, Thomas Cromwell himself was executed. The same man who had helped destroy Anne Boleyn, the same man who had helped shape England's religious revolution, gone, removed, erased. Elizabeth learned another lesson. Power was temporary. Survival required adaptation. Henry VIII would marry 6 times. 2 of his wives would be executed. Others would die. Others would be discarded. Elizabeth grew up inside this cycle of instability, and it forced her mind to develop differently. She learned emotional restraint. She learned patience. She learned to reveal little. These traits would later allow her to outmaneuver men who underestimated her. But as Henry aged, England itself was changing. Religious division deepened. Political factions formed. Foreign powers watched England carefully. Because they understood something, Elizabeth herself was beginning to understand. England was not stable. It was vulnerable, and one day its survival might depend on her. Elizabeth had survived childhood. She had survived illegitimacy. She had survived the execution of her mother, but her greatest danger had not yet arrived. Because when Henry VIII died, the throne would pass through hands that did not trust her, and Elizabeth Tudor would learn what it meant to live under suspicion, inside a kingdom that could destroy her. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the palace did not grow quieter. It grew more dangerous. Elizabeth was only 13 years old, and already she understood something most adults never fully grasp. Power does not disappear. It transfers. And when it transfers, it destabilizes everything. Her half-brother, Edward VI, now sat on the throne. A child king, 9 years old, frail, intensely Protestant, easily influenced, which meant the real power did not belong to him. It belonged to the men surrounding him. And that is where Elizabeth's life began to shift. Thomas Seymour, the first scandal. Thomas Seymour was charming, dangerously charming. He married Henry VIII's final wife, Catherine Parr, who had acted as a mother figure to Elizabeth, which meant Elizabeth was now living in Seymour's household. What happened there would shape her understanding of men, trust, and political vulnerability forever. Seymour began entering her chambers early in the morning, unannounced, playful at first, tickling, teasing, physical familiarity that blurred boundaries. Elizabeth was 14. She did not protest publicly. She observed, she analyzed, she survived. When Catherine Parr discovered the inappropriate behavior, she tried to manage it quietly, but Catherine died shortly after childbirth, and suddenly Elizabeth was alone again. Thomas Seymour, now widowed, became reckless. He attempted to gain influence over young King Edward VI. He plotted, he schemed, and eventually he was arrested for treason. In 1549, he was executed. Beheaded, Elizabeth was interrogated. Not as a child, but as a political suspect. She denied involvement calmly, carefully, strategically. Even at 15, she understood. Words could kill. From this moment forward, Elizabeth mastered one critical survival skill: controlled ambiguity. She would never again allow herself to be cornered emotionally or politically. Edward VI's reign, a kingdom divided. While Elizabeth navigated scandal, England itself was transforming. Edward VI's government aggressively pushed Protestant reforms. Churches were stripped of Catholic imagery. Latin Mass was abolished. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced. To Protestants, this was progress. To Catholics, it was heresy. Religious identity was no longer personal belief. It was political allegiance. And Elizabeth stood in a fragile position. She was Protestant educated, but she was also the daughter of Anne Boleyn, which meant Catholic factions still viewed her as illegitimate. She had to walk carefully, not to Protestant, not to neutral, never extreme, because in England, religious identity could mean imprisonment or death. Edward's death and a dangerous succession. In 1553, Edward VI fell gravely ill. Tuberculosis, he was only 15, and this is where the power struggle intensified. By law, the throne should pass to Mary Henry VIII's eldest daughter. Mary was Catholic, fiercely Catholic. But Edward and his Protestant advisors feared that if Mary became queen, she would reverse all reforms, so they attempted something bold. They named Lady Jane Grey as Edward's successor. a Protestant, a pawn. But England did not support the plan. Within 9 days, Mary gathered enough support to overthrow Jane, and Mary entered London as queen. Elizabeth watched carefully, because now the most dangerous woman in England held the crown. Mary I of England had suffered deeply. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been cast aside by Henry VIII. Mary had been declared illegitimate, humiliated, stripped of status. Now she had power, and she intended to restore Catholicism completely. This began a period of persecution. Protestant leaders were burned at the stake, hundreds executed. The nickname Bloody Mary would later define her reign. Elizabeth, as a known Protestant figure, became a problem, not immediately, but inevitably, the Wyatt Rebellion. In 1554, a rebellion broke out, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt. The rebellion opposed Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, but suspicion fell on Elizabeth. Was she involved? There was no clear evidence, but that did not matter. Mary could not afford uncertainty. Elizabeth was arrested, escorted to the Tower of London, the same tower where her mother Anne Boleyn had spent her final days. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment. Walking through those gates, knowing your mother never walked back out. Elizabeth was 20. She maintained composure, but privately she understood this could be the end. She wrote letters to Mary pleading innocence, carefully worded, never accusatory, never emotional, pure strategy. After weeks of interrogation, no proof emerged. Elizabeth was released, placed under house arrest instead. She survived again, but something changed permanently. She learned that even innocence did not guarantee safety, only power did. Philip II, the international dimension. Mary married Philip II of Spain. This was not just a marriage, it was geopolitical alignment. Spain was the strongest Catholic power in Europe. Elizabeth now had an external enemy watching her movements. Philip viewed her as a Protestant threat. But interestingly, when Mary struggled to produce an heir, Philip considered Elizabeth as a possible successor he could influence. Politics is rarely personal. It is transactional. Elizabeth observed this carefully. Allies could become enemies. Enemies could become strategic assets. This flexibility would later define her reign. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth adopted a pattern that would later define her rule. She committed to nothing publicly. She avoided marriage alliances. She kept suitors uncertain. She mastered delay. Delay is power. The more others waited, the more leverage she gained. Her near execution in the Tower taught her, attachment creates vulnerability. Romantic alliances create factions. Trust creates weakness. From this period, we begin to see the psychological foundation of what would become her most famous identity, the Virgin Queen, not necessarily because of romance, but because independence meant survival. Mary's decline. Mary's reign faced challenges, failed harvests, economic strain, loss of Calais, England's last territory in France. Her health deteriorated, likely ovarian cancer, and perhaps most devastating, she failed to produce an heir, which meant the succession question returned. And this time, there was no alternative. Elizabeth was next in line. The same woman Mary once imprisoned would inherit the crown. On November 17, 1558, Mary died. Elizabeth was 25 years old. When she learned of her sister's death, she reportedly said, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." But beneath that composure was something deeper: relief, calculation, and readiness, because she had already survived court scandal, interrogation, execution threats, religious persecution, international suspicion. She had been tested before she ever wore a crown, and now she was queen. Closing transition, but becoming queen did not end danger, it multiplied it. A Protestant queen ruling a divided nation, Catholic Europe watching nobles questioning her legitimacy, foreign powers calculating invasion, and one unresolved question hovering over everything: would she marry, or would she rule alone? That question would define the next chapter of her reign and determine whether she would survive or fall like so many before her. November 1558. Elizabeth Tudor is 25 years old. A woman in a kingdom that does not trust female rulers. A Protestant queen in a nation divided by faith. The daughter of a beheaded mother. And now she wears the crown. But the crown is not security, it is exposure. The first question, echoing through Parliament, foreign courts, and noble households, was not about policy. It was about marriage. Who will she marry? Because in 16th century Europe, a queen unmarried was considered incomplete, unstable, vulnerable. To many men in power, a female monarch without a husband was an unsolved problem. Elizabeth understood this immediately. Marriage was not romance. Marriage was surrender of leverage. Standing beside her from the beginning was William Cecil, methodical, reserved, strategically brilliant. Cecil did not dominate Elizabeth. He advised her, and more importantly, he understood her instincts. Together, they crafted the Elizabethan religious settlement, a calculated middle path, Protestant in structure, but not aggressively anti-Catholic in tone. The Act of Supremacy restored the monarch as head of the Church of England. The Act of Uniformity standardized worship. This was not theological purity, it was political stabilization. Elizabeth's approach was clear. I will not make windows into men's souls. She did not seek to police private belief. She sought public obedience. That distinction kept England from immediate civil war. It also signaled something critical about her psychology. She preferred control through balance, not extremism. Then there was Robert Dudley, childhood companion, court favorite, charismatic, ambitious. Their closeness was undeniable. Foreign ambassadors reported whispers constantly, "The Queen is in love." Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died mysteriously in 1560. Officially, an accident. Unofficially, suspicion spread rapidly. If Elizabeth married Dudley after that death, it would destroy her credibility. The political risk was enormous. And here is where Elizabeth's strategic restraint appears again. She did not marry him, not because she felt nothing, but because she understood something deeper. A husband could become a rival power center. A husband could weaken her authority. A husband could divide the nobility. She kept Dudley close, but never elevated him to king. Emotional intimacy without political surrender, that became her pattern. Across Europe, proposals arrived. From Philip II of Spain, widower of her sister Mary, from the Archduke Charles of Austria, from French princes, from Scandinavian rulers. Each proposal represented alliance, protection, potential war prevention, but also foreign influence, loss of independence, domestic resentment. Elizabeth's genius was not in rejecting proposals, it was in prolonging them. She entertained negotiations. She allowed discussions to stretch for years. She flirted diplomatically. She delayed decisions. And in that delay, she gained leverage. As long as she remained unmarried, she was a possibility. And possibility is power. Foreign nations hesitated to antagonize England because they might still become aligned through marriage. She turned indecision into strategy. There was another layer beneath the political calculation. Elizabeth ruled in a world that believed women were naturally inferior rulers. Writers and theologians argued that female sovereignty was unnatural. She had to construct an image strong enough to counter that prejudice. So she did something psychologically brilliant. She split her identity. Publicly, she declared, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," but then added, "But I have the heart and stomach of a king." She reframed femininity. She did not deny being a woman, she transcended it symbolically. She began cultivating what would later be known as the Virgin Queen image, not merely sexual purity, but political independence. She married the nation. England became her symbolic spouse. This narrative neutralized pressure. Because if she was already married to her kingdom, then no foreign prince could claim superiority over her. It was myth-making as governance. Year after year, Parliament petitioned her to marry. They feared succession instability. Without an heir, the kingdom could collapse into crisis upon her death. Elizabeth responded with careful speeches, never promising, never refusing, always preserving her advantage. Her famous response, "Though I be a woman, yet I have as good a courage answerable to my place as ever my father had." She invoked Henry VIII strategically. The same father whose court taught her fear now became a symbol of inherited strength. Psychologically, this is fascinating. She took the trauma of her upbringing and repurposed it into political armor. The hidden fear behind all this calculation was something deeper. Marriage meant vulnerability. Her childhood taught her men fall, men betray, men lose their heads. She watched Thomas Seymour executed. She saw how marriage destroyed her mother. She observed Mary the First's political dependency on Philip. Why would she repeat those patterns? Elizabeth's refusal to marry was not only strategic, it was self-protective. Power meant survival, and survival required independence. By the early 1560s, Elizabeth had stabilized religion, secured her throne, avoided civil war, maintained diplomatic flexibility, preserved personal authority. But one unresolved issue remained. Across the northern border, in Scotland, there was another queen, young, Catholic, legitimate in the eyes of many, and to some factions, more rightful than Elizabeth. Her name was Mary, Queen of Scots, and her existence would become the greatest internal threat of Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth had mastered delay, she had mastered image, she had mastered balance, but she had not yet faced direct dynastic rivalry. The question was no longer, will she marry? It became, will she survive a rival who could replace her? Because Mary of Scotland was not a rumor. She was a living alternative, and Europe was watching. In another kingdom, another queen was already ruling. Young, beautiful, and too many Catholics across Europe. The true Queen of England, her name was Mary, Queen of Scots, and her very existence threatened Elizabeth Tudor more than any army ever could. Elizabeth and Mary were cousins, but politically they represented opposite futures. Elizabeth, Protestant English, careful, strategic; Mary, Catholic, Scottish, raised in France. Born into traditional monarchy, Mary became Queen of Scotland as an infant after her father's death. She grew up not in Scotland, but in the glittering court of France. Educated, elegant, fluent in diplomacy and culture. By 16, she was Queen of France as well. Everything about her projected legitimacy. Where Elizabeth had survived suspicion and danger, Mary had been raised to rule, and that difference shaped everything that followed. To Catholic Europe, Elizabeth's claim to the English throne was questionable because her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been declared illegitimate after execution. Some Catholics believed Elizabeth herself was illegitimate. Mary, Queen of Scots, descended from Henry VII through a different line. In their eyes, Mary possessed a stronger hereditary claim. This turned Mary into something incredibly dangerous, a living symbol around which rebellion could form. Elizabeth understood the risk immediately. A rival queen is not merely competition, she is an alternative future. In 1561, tragedy reshaped Europe. Mary's husband, the French king, died. Suddenly, widowed at 18, she returned to Scotland. A land transformed during her absence, Scotland had embraced Protestant reform, and now a Catholic queen ruled a Protestant nation. Mary attempted compromise. She allowed Protestant governance while privately maintaining Catholic faith. But Scotland was unstable. Nobles fought for power. Religious factions clashed, and Mary, inexperienced in political survival, made choices Elizabeth never would. Mary married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, handsome, ambitious, and disastrously unsuitable. Darnley demanded authority equal to the Queen. He wanted the crown matrimonial legal curule. Mary hesitated. Their marriage quickly deteriorated into jealousy and paranoia. Then came murder. Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, was brutally killed in front of her by conspirators connected to Darnley. The violence shocked Europe. It also revealed Mary's vulnerability, where Elizabeth controlled her court through emotional distance. Mary ruled through personal relationships, and those relationships betrayed her. In 1567, Darnley himself died under mysterious circumstances. His residence exploded during the night. His body was later found outside, strangled. Suspicion fell immediately on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Months later, Mary married Bothwell. To many nobles, this confirmed the worst rumors, that Mary had participated in her husband's murder. Whether true or not, perception became reality. Scottish lords rebelled. Mary was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned. Her infant son became King James VI of Scotland. A queen had fallen, but her story was not over. In 1568, Mary escaped captivity. Desperate and politically isolated, she made a decision that would change history. She fled south into England, into Elizabeth's kingdom. She expected protection from a fellow queen. Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma. Executing Mary would make her a martyr. Freeing her could ignite rebellion. Sending her back risked international scandal. So Elizabeth chose a third option. She imprisoned her, not as a criminal, but not as a guest either. Mary would spend nearly 19 years under guarded custody. Alive but politically dangerous, Mary's presence became a magnet for plots. Catholic factions saw her as England's rightful ruler. Secret letters circulated, foreign agents intervened, assassination plans emerged. Elizabeth's intelligence network expanded under Francis Walsingham. Walsingham built one of Europe's earliest professional spy systems. Codebreakers intercepted correspondence. Agents infiltrated conspiracies. Surveillance became constant. This was psychological warfare. Elizabeth rarely acted quickly. She waited, she observed, she gathered proof, because eliminating Mary required justification strong enough to silence Europe. In 1586, the decisive moment arrived. A young conspirator named Anthony Babington coordinated a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Unbeknownst to the conspirators, Walsingham controlled their communication network. Encrypted letters passed through channels already compromised. Mary responded to Babington's proposal. Her reply appeared to approve the plan. It was the evidence Elizabeth had long avoided and long needed. Now, the threat was undeniable. Elizabeth hesitated. Signing Mary's death warrant meant something unprecedented. A reigning monarch executing another anointed queen, it shattered centuries of royal tradition. If monarchs could execute monarchs, then kings and queens everywhere became vulnerable. Elizabeth delayed repeatedly, but Parliament demanded action. Advisors insisted England would never be safe while Mary lived. Finally, in February 1587, Elizabeth signed the warrant. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Footering Castle. Witnesses described dignity in her final moments. She dressed in red, the color of martyrdom. With one act, Elizabeth removed her greatest internal threat. But she also crossed a psychological line. She had ordered the death of a queen. Catholic Europe reacted with outrage, and none more than Philip II of Spain. To him, Mary's execution confirmed Elizabeth as a heretic tyrant. Now war felt justified, not political, not strategic, holy. The execution of Mary did not end danger. It accelerated it. Across Spain, preparations intensified. Ships were built. Soldiers gathered. Plans formed for invasion. Elizabeth had eliminated one enemy, but awakened another, far greater. Elizabeth had survived court intrigue. She had outmaneuvered rebellion. She had defeated a rival queen without ever raising a sword herself. But now, diplomacy would no longer be enough, because across the sea, an empire prepared revenge, and soon England would face the greatest naval force the world had ever seen. By 1587, Europe stood on the edge of inevitable war. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, had changed everything. What had once been rivalry was now vengeance. And in Madrid, one man believed he had both the right and the divine duty to act. His name was Philip II of Spain. Philip did not see himself merely as a monarch. He believed he ruled as God's instrument on earth. Quiet, deeply religious, meticulously organized, unlike charismatic warrior kings, Philip governed through paperwork and relentless administration. From his palace at El Escorial, he managed an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it. Spain controlled territories across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Silver from the New World flowed endlessly into Spanish coffers. Its armies, the feared Spanish tercios, dominated European battlefields. Its navy protected global trade routes. Spain was the superpower of the 16th century, and Philip believed Protestant England threatened the divine order itself. Elizabeth represented everything Philip opposed. She had rejected papal authority. She supported Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, territories under Spanish rule. English privateers attacked Spanish treasure fleets, and now she had executed a Catholic queen. To Philip, this was no longer diplomacy. It was sacrilege. In 1570, Pope Pius V had already excommunicated Elizabeth, declaring her rule illegitimate. This religious decree changed political rules. Catholic rulers were now morally justified in removing her. Philip began to view invasion not as conquest, but as restoration. England must be returned to Catholicism. While Spain prepared openly, England fought indirectly. Elizabeth avoided formal declarations of war. Instead, she authorized privateurs. Men like Francis Drake operated in a legal gray zone. Officially merchants, unofficially, pirates. They attacked Spanish ships carrying gold and silver from the Americas. Each successful raid weakened Spain financially, but it also humiliated Philip. Drake's raids were not only economic attacks, they were psychological insults. Spain's supposedly invincible empire appeared vulnerable, and Philip took these affronts personally. In 1587, Drake launched one of history's boldest preemptive strikes. He sailed directly into the Spanish port of Cadiz. There, English forces destroyed ships, burned supplies, and disrupted invasion preparations. Drake later joked he had singed the King of Spain's beard. The raid delayed Spanish plans by nearly a year, but it did not stop them. Instead, it hardened Philip's resolve. Now invasion became unavoidable. Spain began assembling what would become known as the Spanish Armada. More than 130 ships, war galleons, armed merchant vessels, supply carriers, nearly 30,000 men, soldiers, sailors, priests, and noble commanders. The plan was precise. The Armada would sail through the English Channel. It would meet the Duke of Parma's army waiting in the Spanish Netherlands, then escort thousands of invasion troops across the sea to England. Once landed, England's smaller army would likely collapse quickly. At least that was the assumption, because on paper, Spain's victory seemed inevitable. Originally, command of the Armada belonged to the experienced naval leader Álvaro de Bazan, but he died before the fleet sailed. Philip replaced him with Alonso Pérez de Guzman, a nobleman, wealthy, loyal, but inexperienced at sea. Medina Sidonia himself wrote to the king admitting he suffered from seasickness. He lacked naval expertise. He believed himself unfit for command. Philip refused to reconsider. Obedience mattered more than experience. This decision would haunt the mission. Meanwhile, England understood the danger. Elizabeth's advisors strengthened coastal defenses. Signal beacons were prepared across hills and cliffs. If the Armada appeared, fires would spread warnings. England's navy, though smaller, had advantages. Its ships were faster, lower in profile. Designed for maneuverability rather than boarding combat, commanders like Charles Howard and Drake planned a new style of naval warfare. Instead of closing for hand-to-hand combat, they would attack from distance using cannon fire. Speed would replace strength. Strategy would replace size. Spain sailed with certainty. England prepared with anxiety. Spanish sailors believed God guaranteed victory. English sailors believed survival depended on ingenuity. One side trusted destiny, the other trusted adaptation. History often favors the adaptable. But in 1588, no one yet knew that. To most observers, England's defeat appeared inevitable. Elizabeth projected confidence publicly, but privately, she understood the stakes. If Spain succeeded, she would likely be executed. Her government dismantled, Protestant leaders punished, England absorbed into Catholic Europe. Her entire life, every careful decision, every compromise, every delay, could vanish in a single campaign. For decades, she had survived intrigue and political threats. Now she faced something different: total invasion. In May 1588, the fleet finally departed. Storms forced delays. Repairs slowed progress. But eventually, the Armada regrouped and moved north. Across the Bay of Biscay, toward the English Channel. Watchers along England's coast waited, scanning the horizon, listening for signal fires, praying rumors were wrong. Then one evening, the warning came. Spanish sails had been sighted. The greatest fleet Europe had ever assembled was approaching England, and the fate of a kingdom now rested not only on ships and cannons, but on leadership, because soon Elizabeth would make the decision that defined her legend. The Armada had formed. The invasion had begun. England stood alone against an empire that believed itself chosen by God. The question was no longer whether war would come. The question was whether England could survive it. July 1588. The warning fires began to burn along England's southern coast. From cliff to hilltop, beacons ignited, spreading the message faster than any messenger could ride. The Armada had been sighted. More than 100 Spanish ships moved through the English Channel in disciplined formation. To those watching from shore, it looked less like a fleet and more like a floating city. England's moment of truth had arrived. The Spanish strategy relied on tradition. Their ships were built for boarding combat. Victory meant closing distance, grappling enemy vessels, and allowing heavily armed soldiers to overwhelm opponents. Naval warfare to Spain was an extension of land warfare. But England fought differently. Under Charles Howard, alongside commanders like Francis Drake, the English Navy embraced a new philosophy: speed, distance, precision. English ships were smaller but faster. Their cannons were designed for repeated long-range fire. Instead of boarding, they would strike, withdraw, reload, and strike again. This was modern naval warfare being invented in real time. The English fleet left Plymouth Harbor under cover of night. Legend tells that Drake was calmly finishing a game of bowls when news arrived of the Armada's approach. Whether myth or truth, the story captured English confidence. They would fight on their terms. As dawn broke, English ships approached cautiously. Cannons thundered across the water. Smoke covered the sea. But something unexpected happened. The English refused to engage closely. They circled like predators, firing from range, avoiding capture. The Spanish struggled to respond. Their guns were powerful, but slower to reload. Their formation required cohesion, and cohesion became harder with constant harassment. For nearly a week, English ships shadowed the Armada. They attacked repeatedly, never decisive, but constantly exhausting. Spanish sailors slept little. Damage accumulated slowly, rigging snapped, supplies dwindled. Morale weakened. The Armada continued toward its objective, linking with the Duke of Parma's invasion army in the Netherlands. If that connection succeeded, England could still be invaded. Elizabeth's commanders knew they had to prevent it. At any cost, communication doomed Spanish coordination. Parma's army waited in shallow coastal waters, but his transport barges were vulnerable. Dutch Protestant forces controlled nearby ports. Messages between the Armada and Parma moved slowly. Plans became uncertain. Timing collapsed. Meanwhile, English attacks intensified. Spain's greatest strength, disciplined formation, became its greatest weakness. They could not adapt quickly enough. On the night of July 28th, as the Armada anchored near Calais, England made its boldest move. 8 old ships were packed with gunpowder, tar, and flammable material. Set ablaze, then released toward the anchored Spanish fleet. Fire ships. At first, Spanish sailors believed they were explosive bomb vessels. Panic spread. Anchors were cut. Ships scattered to escape the drifting infernos. The perfect crescent formation broke apart. No massive explosion occurred, but the psychological damage was devastating. For the first time, the Armada lost unity, and once formation broke, England struck. At dawn, English ships attacked aggressively near grav lines. Cannons roared continuously. English gunners fired faster and more accurately than their opponents. Spanish ships suffered heavy damage. Masts shattered. Hull planks splintered. Command coordination collapsed. The English maintained distance, preventing boarding actions entirely. Spain's greatest advantage, its soldiers became useless. Hours of relentless bombardment forced the Armada northward, not destroyed, but crippled, unable to regroup, unable to meet Parma's army. The invasion plan had failed. Throughout the battle, Elizabeth remained inland, receiving updates slowly. Every report carried uncertainty. Victory was not yet assured. If the Armada regrouped, invasion remained possible. Her advisors again urged caution. Prepared evacuation plans, considered worst-case scenarios. But Elizabeth refused panic. She understood leadership during crisis required stability, even when outcomes were unclear. Her calm projected national confidence, and confidence itself became a weapon. With ammunition running low and English ships blocking retreat southward, Medina Sidonia faced an impossible choice: return through the English Channel under enemy fire, or sail north around Scotland and Ireland to return home. He chose the northern route. It seemed safer. It proved catastrophic, because England's greatest ally had not yet entered the battle. The weather. Before the storms even arrived, something fundamental had changed. The myth of Spanish invincibility was broken. English sailors realized they could fight and survive against the greatest empire on earth. Confidence replaced fear. National identity hardened. England was no longer merely defending itself. It was discovering its future as a maritime power. The Armada was retreating, but retreat did not mean survival. Damaged ships now sailed into unfamiliar northern waters. Supplies were exhausted, navigation uncertain, and the Atlantic Ocean waited soon. nature itself would deliver the final judgment. The battle was over, but the war against survival had only begun. What remained of the Spanish Armada drifted northward, no longer an invading force, but a wounded fleet trying to escape a hostile sea. Orders from Spain had been clear: join forces in the Netherlands and invade England. Now, that plan no longer existed. The Duke of Medina Sidonia faced a decision no commander wanted to make. He would abandon the mission. The Armada would retreat, not through the English Channel, where English ships still hunted, but around the northern edge of Britain, into waters few Spanish sailors had ever seen. It was a choice made under pressure, and it would become a journey into disaster. As the fleet turned north, morale collapsed quietly. Spanish sailors had begun the voyage months earlier, filled with certainty. Priests promised divine protection. Officers spoke of inevitable victory. Now silence replaced confidence. Ships were damaged, rigging torn, gunpowder soaked, food supplies dangerously low. Worst of all, they were navigating blind. Spanish maps of northern waters were incomplete. Currents behaved unpredictably. Cold winds cut through exhausted crews unprepared for the Atlantic's brutality. The Armada was no longer fighting England. It was fighting nature itself. Meanwhile, in England, uncertainty lingered. Victory had not yet been confirmed. Queen Elizabeth I waited for reliable news, aware that premature celebration could become humiliation if the Armada regrouped. Messengers arrived slowly, reports conflicted. Some claimed Spanish ships still threatened the coast, others said they were fleeing. The Queen understood something deeply political. Perception mattered as much as reality. England needed certainty, not rumors, because national confidence was fragile. Far to the north, storms began forming. At first, sailors noticed only stronger winds. Then waves grew violent. Within days, the Atlantic unleashed relentless tempests. Ships already weakened by battle could not withstand the punishment. Masts snapped. Rudders failed. Navigation disappeared under black skies and freezing rain. Entire vessels vanished between waves. Men clung to wreckage, praying in languages carried away by the wind. Spanish discipline, so powerful in organized battle, meant little against chaos without pattern or enemy. This was not defeat by cannon. This was survival by chance. One by one, ships wrecked along the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Some crews reached shore only to encounter unfamiliar lands and hostile conditions. Others starved while waiting for rescue that never came. Local populations sometimes helped survivors. Sometimes they feared them. Sometimes English authorities executed captured soldiers to prevent renewed invasion. For many Spaniards, the journey home ended far from Spain. The Great Armada dissolved not in a single dramatic moment, but through slow attrition. Storm after storm erased what remained of imperial ambition. Back in England, confirmation finally arrived. The Armada was gone, not regrouping, not returning, gone. Church bells rang across London. Crowds gathered in spontaneous celebration. Sermons declared divine intervention. But beneath public joy lay something deeper: relief. England had stood on the edge of annihilation and survived. Psychologically, the nation transformed. For decades, England had feared continental powers: Spain, France, and the Catholic alliance of Europe. Now, for the first time, English identity shifted from defensive survival to emerging confidence. They had resisted the strongest empire on earth and lived. For Queen Elizabeth I, the victory reshaped her image permanently. She was no longer merely a queen maintaining stability. She became a symbol, the Virgin Queen, protector of England, a monarch whose reign appeared blessed by Providence itself. Her authority strengthened without needing conquest. And this mattered enormously, because power rooted in belief often lasts longer than power rooted in fear. Historians would later debate whether storms or strategy truly defeated the Armada. The truth was more complex. England won because of preparation, innovation, leadership, and timing. Human decisions forced the Armada into a retreat. Nature ensured it could not recover. Together, they changed history. From this moment forward, England began turning toward the sea, not as a barrier, but as opportunity. Exploration expanded, naval investment increased. A generation of sailors grew inspired by survival against impossible odds. The foundations of future maritime dominance were quietly laid in the wreckage left behind by the Armada, the storm did more than scatter ships. It reshaped a nation's destiny. Victory over the Spanish Armada transformed England, but it also marked the beginning of Queen Elizabeth I's final chapter. The triumph of 1588 made her legendary in the eyes of her people. Paintings portrayed her almost as timeless, untouched by age, crowned in symbols of power, surrounded by images of victory and divine favor. Yet behind the carefully constructed image stood a woman growing older. In a world that never allowed monarchs to appear weak, Elizabeth had ruled England for decades through intelligence, caution, and emotional restraint. She mastered delay, negotiation, and ambiguity, political weapons sharper than swords. But time was the one opponent she could not outmaneuver. As the years passed, many of the figures who had helped shape her reign began to disappear. Trusted advisors died one by one. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, her most loyal counselor, was gone. The generation that had protected the young queen during dangerous beginnings slowly faded away. Their absence left more than political gaps. It left loneliness. Elizabeth increasingly withdrew into routine and ceremony. Court celebrations continued, but observers noticed changes. The queen, who once danced gracefully, now moved carefully. Her famous speeches became rarer. Still, she refused to show vulnerability publicly, because Elizabeth understood something fundamental about monarchy. Power depended on perception. Another question haunted the kingdom: succession. Elizabeth had never married. She had never named an heir. For years, this uncertainty served her politically, preventing rivals from forming factions around a future monarch. But as she aged, the lack of succession became dangerous. Who would rule after her? Foreign powers watched closely. English nobles whispered cautiously. Memories of civil conflict remained fresh in national memory. The peace Elizabeth created depended on what happened next. Privately, attention turned toward Scotland. James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's executed rival, emerged as the most likely successor. The irony was unavoidable. The son of the woman Elizabeth had condemned would inherit the throne she fought her entire life to secure. Yet politically, James represented stability. He was Protestant, educated, and already an experienced ruler. Quiet negotiations ensured that when Elizabeth died, England would not descend into chaos. Even in silence, the Queen was still managing the future. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth's health declined rapidly. She slept less, she ate little. Reports described her standing for hours, refusing to lie down, as if rest itself meant surrender. Makeup concealed age, but not exhaustion. The powerful monarch who once inspired armies at Tilbury now faced the most human of endings alone with memory. In March 1603, at Richmond Palace, Queen Elizabeth I died peacefully after nearly 45 years on the throne. She was 69 years old. With her death, the Tudor dynasty ended. News spread across England with a mixture of grief and uncertainty. For many citizens, Elizabeth had been the only monarch they had ever known. An entire generation had lived under her rule. Church bells rang not in celebration, but mourning, yet something remarkable happened. There was no civil war, no violent struggle for power. The transition occurred peacefully. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under one monarch for the first time. Elizabeth's greatest final achievement may have been invisible. She left behind stability. The England she inherited in 1558 had been divided, vulnerable, and threatened from every direction. The England she left behind was confident, culturally vibrant, and increasingly outward-looking. During her reign, England resisted foreign domination. Its navy evolved into a powerful force. Exploration expanded beyond Europe. Literature and theater flourished. National identity strengthened. The foundations were laid for what would eventually become a global empire. But Elizabeth herself never saw that future. She built the stage, others would perform upon it. Even centuries later, her legacy remains visible. Modern Britain still carries institutions shaped during her reign: parliamentary balance, naval tradition, and cultural influence born from the Elizabethan era. Historians continue to debate her decisions, her caution, and her contradictions. Was she pragmatic or indecisive? Compassionate or calculating? Perhaps she was both. Because Elizabeth I ruled not through absolute power, but through understanding human nature, fear, loyalty, ambition, and belief. She survived conspiracies, religious conflict, assassination plots, and invasion. Not by being the strongest ruler in Europe, but by being the most adaptable. In the end, the Queen, who never married, became symbolically bound to her nation forever. She called herself married to England, and when she died, England did not collapse, it endured. The storm had passed, the nation survived, and history remembered her not simply as a monarch, but as the woman who guided England through its most dangerous century and left it ready to face the world. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, an era ended, but England's story did not. In many ways, it was only beginning. For nearly 45 years, Elizabeth had held the kingdom together through caution, diplomacy, and calculated strength. She prevented religious collapse, resisted foreign domination, and gave England time to stabilize and grow. Now, for the first time in generations, England faced a question without her. What comes after a legend? James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, uniting two crowns under one ruler. The transition was peaceful, something rare in European history. Elizabeth had left behind not chaos, but continuity, yet James ruled differently. Where Elizabeth mastered political balance, James believed strongly in the divine right of kings. Tensions slowly grew between monarchy and parliament. Tensions Elizabeth had carefully managed but never fully resolved. Those tensions would eventually explode. Less than 50 years after Elizabeth's death, England descended into civil war. King fought parliament, neighbor fought neighbor. The English Civil War shattered the illusion that monarchy alone guaranteed stability. King Charles I was executed, an unthinkable act in Elizabeth's time. For a brief moment, England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell. It was proof that the political world Elizabeth preserved had begun transforming. Power was shifting from crown alone toward institutions. But Elizabeth's deeper legacy survived the turmoil. Her investment in naval strength allowed England to expand overseas. English ships crossed oceans not just for survival, but exploration and trade. Colonies formed, trade networks expanded. The small island nation she defended slowly evolved into a global maritime power. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain would build one of the largest empires in human history, stretching across continents. Historians often trace that rise back to a single turning point, 1588, the year England survived long enough to become something greater. Culturally, the Elizabethan spirit never disappeared. The age that produced William Shakespeare reshaped English language and storytelling forever. Literature, theater, and intellectual life flourished because Elizabeth's reign created stability where creativity could grow. England began seeing itself not merely as a kingdom, but as a nation with identity and purpose. That idea would endure. Time moved forward. Empires rose and fell. Industrial revolutions transformed society. 2 world wars reshaped global power, and Britain itself changed from empire to modern constitutional monarchy. Yet echoes of Elizabeth's era remain visible even today. The balance between monarchy and government, the naval traditions, the cultural confidence born from survival against overwhelming odds, even modern Britain's global influence carries traces of decisions made during her reign. Elizabeth I never called herself great. She ruled cautiously, often uncertain, frequently alone. But history measured her differently. She inherited a fragile kingdom surrounded by enemies. She left behind a nation capable of shaping the modern world. And perhaps her greatest achievement was this: she ensured England's story would continue long after she was gone. Today, centuries later, her image still survives in portraits, books, and memory, not simply as a queen, but as a symbol of resilience. A ruler who understood that leadership is not about avoiding storms, but guiding a nation through them. And that is why the story of the Spanish Armada is not only a story about war, it is a story about survival, about transformation, and about how one woman's decisions changed the direction of history, not just for her lifetime, but for centuries to come.